So the CHS, the Core Humanitarian Standard for Quality and Accountability, is really essential to how we improve our quality, effectiveness of the aid delivery to better serve the people affected by crisis. And there's two ways that I would highlight this. The Core Humanitarian Standard itself has 9 commitments it makes to affected people. And so the first point I want to make is really that the commitment of the Core Humanitarian Standard is to the affected people themselves. The ideal of the Core Humanitarian Standard is that the people themselves know what quality, what accountability they have in the aid that they receive and can start to turn that wave of holding organisations to account to their delivery. I think the ultimate aim is that we all are putting the people affected really at the centre of our work. This is something that we talk about, but the CHS, the Core Humanitarian Standard, really turns that into kind of commitments that organisations are making to the people. So I think the CHS is really important in this, the sort of the divide between disaster, conflict, where we get a multiple of different effects that are making people vulnerable. Because what it does is it puts the person at the centre. And that's a term that's been maybe overused. But if you start to focus in on the person rather than the response, many of the issues that they're facing are the same, whether it's from the conflict or whether it's from the disaster. They've just been felt in a different way by that person. But ultimately, what we want is that person has the means of getting back on their feet better and quicker, that the response is localised, that that person is treated with respect and dignity. And those are what the Core Humanitarian Standard is setting out in its commitments. So by putting the person and then trying to work out what our response should be, in some ways it doesn't matter whether it's a conflict or whether it's a natural disaster if you put the person at the centre.
One conflict-sensitive tool that we can share is the conflict tree analysis. It's a really powerful tool to explore all situations perceived to lead to conflicts, not only to observe which are the situations, but also the causes and effect that these situations might have. So in simple, for example, the roots of the tree will symbolize the causes, and the branches will symbolize how this conflict might generate different kind of impacts. I remember a disaster risk reduction project. It was about the river floods, and the project was about the construction of protection walls. And before the implementation of the project, this tool was used to analyze all the possible sources of conflict, but also because where the wall was about to be built, it might affect also the amount of water available for other communities by the end of the river or in other part of the river. So this tool was quite effective to really understand all the possible conflict that may arise. But it's also interesting that this tool, in this sense, not only allows you to understand which are the possible conflicts, also to understand or to explore the conflict already present in the project, around the project, or in the places where the project will be implemented.
We think that it's very important to use a do no harm policy. Cordet has developed such a policy, and it includes 3 key elements. First, the important is that you know the context in which you operate. The second one is that you know the impact of your program and the relation of your program and that context. And the third element is then to ensure that your program will not have negative impact on that context.
So how do you go about understanding the context? How do you do that practically?
We have developed a tool for conflict risk analysis to really understand the context according to the conflict and the fragility issues. And that conflict risk analysis contains different elements to study. And one element is really to know what type of conflict you talk about, what level of conflict. Another issue is to know the actors, so which are the key stakeholders involved in the conflict. Third element is to know the causes of the conflict, which can be political, economic, or otherwise. And the fourth is to analyze the trends of the conflict over time. And then when you have all that information, you can make an analysis of the risk of the conflict and then adjust your programming according to the risk that you see.
Clear. And can you give us one concrete example of how you use these tools in the field?
By now, Coordate is piloting this conflict risk analysis tool in northwest Uganda, where you have a situation of South Sudanese refugees coming to settle there, and there are some issues with the host communities. So by analyzing those issues, we can ensure that our program will really target those issues and not make conflicts worse between host communities and refugees, and even ensure there are good relationships. So you also work on conflict prevention.
Yeah, my DRR program is mostly a very long-term program. So you have to really look into other things that are related to how you do your disaster risk reduction. And there are so many underlying issues when you look at disaster risk reduction. One of them is issues on, let's say, poverty. These communities, what kind of, socioeconomic status of this community. You have to look at issues on conflict, what are, kind of the conflicts which these communities have been facing or are facing, and that way you'll be able to have a holistic understanding. Under the Partners for Resilience program, which Coordate is implementing, we are actually looking at principles behind how you develop a DRR program, but in an integrated way. We call it an integrated risk management. So when you are looking at disaster, you're not just looking at disaster risk reduction, but you're also linking it with climate change, because it happens that climate change has also impact on these disasters. You're looking at issues on environmental degradation. This is where the communities actually benefit from those ecosystem services for their own livelihood. So these three approaches are very much interrelated, and it's very important to understand the underlying issues, which actually varies from one community to another.
The tool I know, in my experience, is the stakeholder mapping. It's actually very efficient to use to map the whole stakeholders and the parties who are related to the project. And by using the stakeholder mapping, we can reduce the conflict. And also we can see the sources of the conflicts. For example, the power imbalance and other problems, you can see it when we use the stakeholder mapping.
And who are the stakeholders typically?
Actually, many people they have it in their mind about the beneficiaries as a main group, and UN staff and the other NGO staff, but not to forgotten the authorities, the local authorities, the state authorities, and also the private sector. For example, if you bring in food, some private sector who are selling food, they can be also affected. And that is not actually the aim of helping people.
So how do you avoid that then?
It's actually, we listen to them, they come with their ideas, and we involve them in project.
It can be very important to take into account connectors and dividers in project planning and to adapt projects in conflict-prone areas, because conflict between groups might be prevented and projects can be better implemented with a better environment for the rest of the project. Based on experience, for example, in Afghanistan, there was a project on sustainable agrarian livelihoods that was aiming at reducing the risk of droughts and floods, natural disasters like that. And the practitioners have actually used the tool of connectors and dividers and have identified potential risk factors of conflict and adapted the project taking that into account, and they possibly reduce the risk of conflict in an area where this is really a problem.
Those were some great tips for how you can integrate conflict into your disaster policies. Something that is highly relevant, considering the fact that do-no-harm approaches and conflict sensitivity are currently underutilized in disaster risk reduction intervention design, delivery, and monitoring processes. You're now ready for your first two reflective assignments. This week, you have been introduced to 5 different tools that can help you in developing and implementing conflict-sensitive policymaking. We're now going to use one or more of these tools in an assignment. If you want to reread what was just said, check out the reports and files in the resources section about the tools and use that information for the end assignment.